Hey guys, Arm&Gun here today with part 5 of my 5-part series covering the new, somewhat concerning firearms legislation released by the Canadian government on February 16th. This is all new knowledge. I definitely want to have the caveat out there, the disclaimer. This is very new. I am not a legal expert. I'm merely trying to leverage my platform and the viewership that it gets to try and disseminate as much knowledge as quickly as possible. And I've approached this I talked more about this in my introduction. This is part 5. This is my close. I'm wrapping things up and giving my thoughts on whether or not I think this thing will pass and turn into actual legislation. And otherwise, I have an introduction that kind of frames this whole thing, the way I approached it. And the 3 videos in between that and this one were the meat and potatoes of the legislation itself. That being the grandfathering clause, which will be music to most of our ears, with regard to the OIC ban that took away a lot of our firearms last May. So within this legislation there is a grandfathering privilege or provision, I should say. So it looks like if this goes to pass, that's the silver lining. So we get to keep our stuff if we want. We get to choose to keep our stuff if we want. There's a lot of additional stuff there, and I talked more about that in part 2 of this video series. Part 3 was maybe like the shotguns in the OIC ban, maybe it's unintended, but there's a very real risk, the way I read it and the way a lot of my peers have read it and informed me, there's a very real risk of airsoft, or at least a huge chunk of it, getting tied up and wrapped in all this as well and also being banned, which would be very unfortunate. Then there is the rest. That was part 3. Part 4 was the municipalities getting more power to, or getting the power to ban or otherwise introduce legislation against or governing the use of handguns within their borders. Talked about some safe storage stuff, talked about a little bit more of the red flag stuff that's coming down the pipe, and a little bit of stuff in magazines. But again, part 4 is probably my weakest. That was the stuff I knew and researched the least. I'm trying to get this all out. I'm filming all this stuff the night of the 16th so that it could all be released on the 17th for you guys. So this is not my typical content. If you guys have seen this, I'm not normally a legal political channel. I've mentioned this in some of the other videos as well. My stuff is what you see on the wall. You know, I'm all about putting out entertaining and informational content, educational stuff on firearms. I do mechanical stuff. I do field strips. I do the full, history and stuff of the development of the firearm. I do some live fire demonstrations and weapon handling and things like that and how all the controls work. I do that as well. And some other fun stuff too. We do 5 guns. We do upgrading guns. We have a lot of fun on the channel as well. But that's the core. Entertaining and educational, not so much political and legislative. So this is a stretch for me. I'm a little bit outside my element, but I wanted to leverage, again, the platform size that I have to get this, make this as wide of a sounding board as kind of I can. So guys, please use the comments below productively. Bring in other sources and resources. Let's keep this thing up to date. If I'm going to do any more on this topic going forward, it's going to be most likely on my social media. At arm.and.gun is my Instagram. I'm on Facebook as well, but Facebook is it's kind of there as a placeholder. My Instagram stuff gets ported automatically onto it, so it's kind of just there for people that don't want to use Instagram. But I'm mainly active on Instagram, basically every day. But if you guys DM me, my DMs do pile up pretty heavily, so please don't rely on getting a hold of me there. If you shoot in the comments below, I'm obviously going to be doing my best to at least initially moderate some of this stuff. I want to focus on the resource, the productivity, and the ability of this to be a good resource for the community going forward. So I'm going to get rid of trash as I see it. But otherwise, if you guys really need to get a hold of me, I do have a Patreon as well. Busy guy inside and outside of firearms. And answering a bunch of questions does take away from my ability to produce content and make money in my day job to help fund some of the stuff. So if you guys absolutely need my ear, I do make it available. If you message me on Patreon, those guys that throw a few bucks at my channel a month, I get back to you there. Anyways, that's the preamble. Going forward, do I think this has merit? Do I think this has teeth? Well, there's some teeth in it, that's for sure. This is not good stuff. It's more power. It's slipping further down the slope, which we don't want. But there's 2 camps out there. Some think that this is not going to pass. Some think that this is going to pass. And the intricacies of that, unfortunately, it's sad. It has less to do with the merit of any of this legislation and more to do with politicking and the maintaining the current balance of power. So For those of you that aren't, again, I'm not a poli-sci major or anything like that. Again, this is well outside my element. I understand what I understand largely because of my involvement in firearms over the years. I mean, I'm a civilian, first and foremost, that enjoys firearms. And that enjoyment and passion led me into getting into the industry of the business as well. So I do my thing, but I do it pretty quiet. I do it on my own. You know, I'm not bugging anybody. I'm not trying to. But being a firearm owner in Canada, whether as a business or an individual, necessitates knowing a lot of stuff, because ignorance is not an excuse. Ignorance of the law, and there's a lot of stuff that can go awry pretty quickly if you get into the wrong stuff with firearms. So you need to know your stuff, at least to a limited degree, so I feel comfortable at least a little bit in discussing some of this stuff. Basically, that's just my caveat to all of that. But anyways, okay, so the likelihood of this passing. Again, happy that it's being introduced as proper legislation, going through the proper channels. That's all very good. That's what we should be doing as a democratic nation. So this is introduced now, right now in Canada. This is where it gets interesting, intricate, and complex. We have a minority government. It's formed by the Liberals, and they're pretty close. They got a pretty high minority. Like they're 150s. They need 170 seats to basically govern in Canada of the 338 total seats. They have 154 or 154. Conservatives have 120. So they're a not very distant second, but those are the two main players. Everyone else is much further down the ladder. You have Bloc Québécois, my apologies if I'm pronouncing that incorrectly, with I think 36, and NDP with 24. Then there's the Green Party and Independents, which are I think 3 and 5 respectively. Insofar as this conversation continues, the Green Party and the Independents don't come into play. Their numbers don't amount to anything that would sway this decision. So this really becomes, and the Conservatives are also irrelevant in this consideration of this topic, because they're going to be against this legislation. So they're against it. That's 120 seats against. That doesn't matter. They're against. So Liberals are obviously going to be for it. They're the ones that introduced this legislation, and now it becomes interesting. So this is going to get hung up on the provision of grandfathering. I believe both NDP and especially Bloc Québécois did not want grandfathering. A lot of the legislation, a lot of the existing gun control in Canada stems back to a very horrifying, terrible act that was committed in the late 80s in Quebec. Horrible. I talked about this, I think, in my first part. Inexcusable, just horrible. I can't even begin to imagine. Unfortunately, that has led to a very emotional response to a lot of the stuff, and that instituted all the bans back in the day. All of those bans, though, came with grandfathering clause that actually had a lot of provisions in them. Like for people, if you owned the guns back then that got banned, you got a grandfather license. You could still even use the guns back then until they stopped giving you the provisions, the authorization of transports. But you can still buy, sell, trade to this day. Guys with machine guns, 12.2, they can buy, sell, trade. Other guys that had the license. Now, there's very few. Those people are dying every month, I'm sure, in Canada, because I think the minimum age to have that license is going to be something like 63. So, or somewhere around that mark, anyways, and up. I think last I checked, there were less than 500 people in Canada that still have that license. Anyways, I digress. Those grandfathering licenses had a lot more provisions. The ones they're proposing here have a lot less. They're proposing a grandfathering so that they get a higher turnout. They have a more successful buyback scheme, right? Like it's partially buyback, it's partially just getting guns registered. And they know, based on how things have gone in other buybacks and previous bans, they're going to have a greater turnout if they let guys keep their guns in exchange for registering them. There was no problems with the previous guns in the previous bans 25, 30 years ago. They haven't been used in crimes. So they've got it's not very hard for them to offer this on the table. Now, Quebec is very emotional about this. I don't want to say understandably. I appreciate how horrible that was and how hard that must be, but emotions need to be pulled outside of legislation. It needs to be cold hard facts, in my honest opinion. And the cold hard facts are that these previous bans haven't, at least the grandfather, we do know them having been grandfathered has not led to any increase in crime. So there's that. So there's really no reason why not to grandfather these. We can argue all the other points, but I really don't see an issue against this. However, yeah, the Liberals are doing this to fulfill their promises to their base. Now, the Bloc Québécois, they don't want this. They came out back in May last year saying that they would not support further legislation. They didn't support it if it wasn't going to actually pull all the guns out. They didn't want any grandfathering clause. Same thing, I think, with to a lesser extent, I think NDP would also still prefer like harsher legislation against guns. So they're probably all for no grandfathering in favor of just straight buyback, all the guns being confiscated. So now this interesting political aspect is what comes into play. So there's enough seats, like both either Bloc Québécois or NDP on their own could opt in or out and change this decision. If they both opt out, it changes the decision. If they both opt in, it changes the decision. If one opts out, one opts in, again, the status quo is maintained. This legislation goes through. Now, I think the Bloc Québécois will take their stand and they'll vote against it. I think on the grounds of this. I think so. They can maintain strong within their demographic or their supporters. They can do that, and they can do so comfortably knowing that while they're going against this legislation, it's still going to pass, because I certainly think that the NDP will take it. And there's a very political balance of power reason for doing this. And I found this on the forum, Canadian Gun Nuts. Like it or hate it, there's a lot of informed users on there, and I read through some of the many pages of comments on this discussion that popped up today, obviously. And some of the comments, obviously garbage. A lot of the comments, though, are very informed. People know what they're talking about, and they're putting a good information on there. One guy laid it out very, very well. I should have wrote his name down because I feel bad because I'm using his comment now as point. I'll reference it in the comments below because maybe I can link to the forum below to this comment because I thought it was pretty informed. It made sense. Very simple, but it made sense, and I think it informs pretty well where the Liberal or where the NDP party is going to go with this one. So for the record, I'm stating I think that this is how it's going to play out. I think Bloc Québécois will go against. I think Liberals will go, or NDPs will go for with the Liberals to ultimately pass this thing, because there's kind of four ways this plays out. Right now, the Liberals are I keep saying the Liberals. NDPs are in about the best position that they could probably hope to be in. Because in lieu of another election, I think if they went against it, I don't think that would trigger a non-confidence vote. I'm not really informed on how that works. I don't know if this is an important enough piece of legislation that would trigger a non-confidence if they voted again, if this bill failed to pass with the Liberals. But nonetheless, I think the NDP will back it, because if this were to trigger election, or if in the next election, basically an electoral outcome couldn't really get any better and obviously NDPs could form minority or majority government and be in a better position. I don't think that, no one thinks it's going to happen right now. We're just not there. Not there yet. We're still, if there's another election, it's either going to be very likely a majority, either Liberal or Conservative. And in both those cases, the NDP's current position loses. They lose power because they become irrelevant. As soon as there's a majority government, the opposition doesn't matter, because the majority government can do whatever they want. So there's four scenarios in another election, and in three of them, the Liberals or the NDP lose power. They lose position from where they are now. The fourth option is they basically just stay the same. So they don't want to trigger this. But anyways, I'll go through those for the sake of it. So again, option one, Conservatives or Liberals get a majority. Liberals become irrelevant as opposition. Option number two is either party makes a minority government, but the Liberals lose ground. So either party makes Liberal ground, but NDP, so either Conservative or, sorry, I'm stumbling on this a little bit here. Either Conservatives or Liberals form a minority government, again, as they have. However, the NDP lose seats to the point where they're no longer powerful enough to, on their own, make up the difference between the minority party making a majority decision and passing legislation. So that's option number two. Option number three is, again, minority government, but it's the Conservatives and the NDP maintain their current position where they have enough power to make a decision, but now they're forced to side with the CPC, the Conservative Party of Canada, which basically would be, their worst. They don't want to do that. They're going to lose ground with their base if they're siding with Conservatives, because Conservatives are kind of one end of the spectrum, not really one end, but for simplicity's sake, NDP is on one side, Liberals in the middle, Conservatives on the other side. That's really dumbing it down. Not really representative, but dumbing it down. So they're not going to want to do that. And the fourth and final outcome of another election is that basically things are exactly the way they are now. Liberals form the minority, and NDP have a similar position where they can single-handedly make up the difference between liberals in the minority and making a majority decision. In which case nothing changes. So that was my long-winded way of explaining that there's really no way for the liberals to benefit from I keep saying liberals, apologies, NDP to benefit from this thing going the other way. They're going to want to maintain the balance of power the way it is because they have the most power. They have the most power in this current legislation. Because I think Quebec will veto it or will go against it. So really, NDP are in the hot seat. They're the ones holding the potato, and they get to decide what to do with it. So, and again, in a minority government, in a country where the NDP are unlikely to form a government in terms of minority or majority, this is their best case scenario. They hold the most power in this scenario. So their motivation is going to be maintaining the status quo. Typically, minority governments don't last very long in Canada. This one's been prolonged by the whole, everything's gone on in 2020. So that's been good for NDP. They get to make some power moves, look at their base, hopefully improve their turnout in the next election when that happens. But I don't think they're going to be in a position to wanting to trigger it. Because again, there's 4 possible outcomes and only one of them works for them. And that's basically just to maintain the status quo. So they got it pretty good. They're not going to want to rock the boat. Anyways, guys, that's the video for tonight. That's the series on this mess. I did not wake up thinking I was going to be doing this today, but I think it's important for the community. Otherwise, we're going to be back to our regular scheduled programming later on this week. I got to get wherever that DSR went to my previous videos. I've got to get that thing wrapped up and sent back off to its owner, Roger Armtac. Much thanks for lending me that thing. Anyways, guys, that's it. Thanks a ton. Catch you in the next one. Arm and Gun out.